Jack the Ripper. It was the late Victorian autumn of 1888, and the East End of London, Whitechapel, was a place of tight alleys, overcrowded lodging houses, and a population stretched thin by poverty, migration, and social neglect. The district's narrow streets and tenements had long been mapped by social reformers, journalists, and the police alike as a geography of vulnerability. Families and individuals living cheek by jowl, men and women eking out a living in casual labor, servants, casual trades, or in the case of many women, informal sex work that the law and society criminalized or ignored. In that atmosphere, one sequence of murders, swift in time and brutal in form, would seize the city's imagination and refuse to let go. The murder series, concentrated between August and November 1888, would become synonymous with a name that no one ever proved belonged to a person: Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel, a city within a city. To understand the murders, we must first understand the place where they happened. Whitechapel in 1888 was not merely poor. It was a nexus where homelessness, hunger, and the rapid churn of Victorian industrialization collided with a booming, sensational press. Lodging houses, common lodging houses, and the market economy created movement and anonymity. The policing of the district was underfunded and overstretched. Men and women drifted through transient networks. Language barriers and suspicion of authorities often prevented clear reporting and cooperation. The criminal justice institutions of the time were products of their era: rudimentary forensic science, limited laboratory capability, and a police force lacking the manpower and centralized investigative methods modern audiences would expect. These structural realities help explain, though they do not excuse, why the killer remained at large. The canonical 5: names, dates, the facts. Historians and investigators usually point to 5 killings between late August and early November 1888 as the core or canonical Ripper murders. These 5 victims are: Mary and Polly Nichols, found August 31st, 1888, Bucks Row, Whitechapel. Annie Chapman, found September 8th, 1888, near the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Elizabeth Stride, found September 30th, 1888, Dutfield's Yard off Burner Street. Catherine Eddowes, also found in the early hours of September 30th, 1888, Mitre Square, City of London. Mary Jane Kelly, found November 9th, 1888, in her room at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street. Each of these cases involved cut throats and, in most cases, mutilation of the body in a manner contemporaries described as surgical or anatomical. The timing and similarity of wounds, especially the throat cutting and abdominal mutilations, led police and many contemporaries to suspect a single perpetrator. The murders unfolded rapidly over 9 weeks and shocked London with the intensity, proximity, and brutality of the attacks. The victims as people, lives erased from the headlines. For many years, public narratives concentrated on the killer, his methods, his imagined psychology, the sensational letters claiming to be from him. For too long, the women he killed were reduced to a single word in press copy: prostitute. Modern historians have worked to recenter those lives and show how each woman had a full biography, difficult, precarious, and too often invisible to polite society. Hallie Rubenhold's modern reappraisal argues cogently that rather than being defined by their deaths, these women had histories of work, family connections, hopes and hardships, domestic abuse, economic displacement, abandonment, that led them into marginal survival strategies. Rubenhold's reading reshapes the moral equation. It is possible to see these killings not as footnotes to a murderer's legend, but as the erasures of 5 human lives that happened within a social order that repeatedly failed them. Sketches of the 5. 1. Mary and Polly Nichols, circa 1845, found August 31st, 1888. Life and circumstances. Born Mary Ann Walker, then known by the nickname Polly, Nichols had a complicated adult life: marriage, separations, spells of domestic instability, and long periods of poverty. She took casual work when she could, and at times relied on lodging houses in Whitechapel. Contemporary records show family ties and children, but also repeated economic stress that pushed her into precarious nighttime survival patterns. Modern historians emphasize that calling her simply a prostitute collapses a far more complex life into a single label. How she was found and autopsy summary. Polly Nichols's body was discovered in Bucks Row, now Durward Street, on the morning of August 31st, 1888 by a cart driver. The coroner's report and the Metropolitan Police docket record that her throat had been cut, both carotid arteries severed, and she had sustained incised wounds to the abdomen. The official cause of death was hemorrhage due to the severing of major neck vessels. Post-mortem notes and police scene descriptions record the position of the body, nearby bloodstains, and the time window for the attack based on witness sightings that evening. Investigative notes and public reaction. This killing became the first of the canonical five to gain major press attention. The Illustrated Police News and other papers printed engravings and lurid detail, fueling public fear. Police inquiries included house-to-house inquiries, witness interviews from lodging houses, and a large number of false leads and hoax tips that distracted investigators. MEPO files record the early collection of witness statements and inquest testimony. 2. Annie Chapman, Eliza and Chapman, c. 1841, found September 8, 1888. Life and circumstances. Annie Chapman, sometimes recorded as Eliza and Smith or Chapman, had lived through multiple marriages and separations, suffered economic hardship, and intermittently struggled with alcohol. She worked sporadically, darning, casual tasks, and spent periods in lodging houses. Recent historiography reconstructs her movements and family background to show her as a person with ties and responsibilities, not just as a sensational victim label. How she was found and autopsy summary. Chapman's body was found on the morning of September 8, 1888 in the rear yard of 29 Hanbury Street. The post-mortem revealed a deep throat incision and extensive abdominal mutilations. Contemporary reports and coroner's notes recorded removal or severe damage to organs. Period reporting varied in precision. The nature of the wounds, deep cutting of the throat and extensive abdominal injuries, helped establish the pattern that investigators associated with the Ripper. Investigative notes and context. Chapman's murder intensified public alarm and police pressure. The Whitechapel district saw increased patrols and appeals for witnesses. Investigators documented dozens of leads, but many proved false. The press published repeated reconstructions and sometimes speculative surgical interpretations that blurred medical fact and sensationalism. 3. Elizabeth Long Liz Stride, Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, c. 1843, found September 30, 1888. Life and circumstances. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden and later immigrated. In London, she used the name Stride and worked intermittently as a cleaner and casual laborer. She had lived in several East End lodging houses. Large, physically noticeable stature earned her the nickname Long Liz. Her personal history similarly includes marriage and divorce, and later precarious work and housing circumstances. How she was found and autopsy summary. Stride's body was discovered early on September 30, 1888 in Dutfield's yard off Berners Street. Her throat had been cut and she died of hemorrhage, but unlike Chapman and Nichols, Stride's body did not show the extensive abdominal mutilation typically seen in other canonical victims. Because her body lacked the typical mutilation, investigators and historians have long debated whether her murder was by the same hand and whether the killer had been interrupted. Several contemporaneous statements suggest a possible interruption. Investigative notes and significance. Stride's death occurred on the same night as Catherine Eddowes' murder, later that same early morning, and the double discovery heightened panic. For some investigators, Stride's lack of abdominal mutilation suggested either a different offender or simply an interrupted attack. The contemporary police dockets record witness interviews that suggest the killer may have been disturbed while attacking Stride. 4. Catherine Kate, Eddowes, circa 1842, found September 30, 1888. Life and circumstances. Catherine Eddowes, also spelled Eddowes or Eddowes in records, had a history of family breakdown, alcohol dependency, and sporadic work. Like the others, she passed through common lodging houses and had tenuous social supports. Historians have highlighted that Eddowes lived in the border area between the Metropolitan Police and the city police jurisdictions, which later complicated the investigation. How she was found and autopsy summary. Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square in the city of London in the early morning hours of September 30th, 1888, less than an hour after Stride was found. Her throat had been cut and her abdomen severely mutilated. Pathological reports of the time recorded that part of her left kidney had been removed. This detail later fed into the controversy surrounding the From Hell letter and the kidney parcel that arrived with it. Metropolitan Police files include detailed post-mortem sheets and docket entries for Eddowes' case, investigative notes, and jurisdictional issues. Because Eddowes was found within the City of London boundary, a separate police jurisdiction from the Metropolitan Police, coordination problems arose between the two forces. That night, already the scene of two murders, the police had to pool evidence and reconcile witness statements across precinct lines, adding delays and confusion to the investigation. 5. Mary Jane Kelly, Mary Jane Marie Kelly, c. 1863, found November 9, 1888. Life and circumstances. Mary Jane Kelly is the most poorly documented in early life, but is known to have been young, working in the East End in various precarious trades, and living in tiny rented rooms in Miller's Court and Dorset Street. She had earlier aliases and itinerant living patterns. Contemporaneous witnesses described her as flirtatious, attractive, and socially visible on the streets late at night. Modern researchers reconstruct her background from lodging house registers and witness testimony. How she was found and autopsy summary. Kelly's murder on November 9, 1888. Some records date discovery to the morning of November 9 or the night of 8 to 9. Occurred inside her own single room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street. The murderer had privacy and time. The body showed the most extreme mutilation of any canonical victim, with extensive disfigurement and removal of organs. The state of the crime scene and the body made this murder chronologically the last of the canonical five and the most shocking to contemporaries. Post-mortem reports are lengthy and detailed in the MEPO files. Investigative notes and implications. Because Kelly was attacked indoors, questions about whether the killer had known her or lured her arise. The interior nature of the crime allowed more time for mutilation, suggesting a deliberate escalation or opportunity the killer seized. The MEPO files and coroner's reports include detailed measurements, descriptions of the room and the victim's wounds, all of which fed later profiling efforts. These biographical sketches are necessarily condensed here. Modern biographies and archival material give fuller, humanizing accounts of each woman's life prior to the murders, the scenes, forensics, and the language of mutilation. The late 19th century had begun to develop medical legal practices. Postmortems were performed, and pathologists recorded wounds and attempted to determine cause and approximate time of death. In 1888, pathologists such as Dr. Thomas Openshaw were engaged by the police and by independent surgeons to examine tissues and, in at least one reported case, a kidney fragment. The nature of the cuts, deep slashes to the throat and mutilation of the abdomen, sometimes with internal organs exposed, led both contemporaries and subsequent investigators to suggest the killer may have had some anatomical knowledge. That suggestion fed into sensational stories of a surgical killer, but modern scholars caution against overstating that point. The presence of damaged or removed organs does not automatically prove formal medical training. The chaotic nature of attacks, variations between scenes, and the fact that many alleged surgical cuts could be inflicted by a determined attacker with a sharp knife complicate any simple claim about the killer's professional background. Still, for Victorians, the wounds implied a monstrous competence that made the killer more terrifying in the public imagination. The press and the production of terror. Newspapers in 1888 fed a voracious appetite for grisly detail. Sensational headlines, illustrative engravings, and lurid editorializing amplified both public fear and fascination. Importantly, the same press industry that reported the facts also manufactured some of the mythology. Hoax letters, invented eyewitness accounts, and speculative editorials all circulated widely. In this media ecosystem, the name Jack the Ripper, first appearing in a letter that some believe was penned by a journalist or hoaxer, became the brand of the crimes. The press appetite for horror both fed public anxiety and, according to some documented confessions and later historical research, may have induced journalists to invent or embellish correspondence purporting to be from the killer to increase circulation. Thus, the interplay between crime and media was a force multiplier. It transformed a series of murders into a national obsession. Letters from Hell, Dear Boss, and From Hell. Hundreds of letters landed on desks across London, some genuine, many hoaxes. Two of the most infamous are the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter. The Dear Boss letter, which used the signature Jack the Ripper, included taunting language and mentioned mutilations. It gained notoriety after the second double killing when a supposed promise within it, about clipping the lady's ears, seemed to echo the wounds on Catherine Eddowes. The From Hell letter is darker still. It arrived addressed to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and was accompanied by half a human kidney preserved in spirits. A pathologist examined the kidney and confirmed it was human. Whether it belonged to Eddowes remains debated. The provenance and authenticity of both letters are contested. Many modern researchers think the early Dear Boss material might have been a journalist hoax, whereas some argue the From Hell communication might be among the few. Items of possible authenticity. The letters, authentic or not, shaped the public narrative, confirming and amplifying a monstrous persona that the city could neither capture nor silence. The police response, organization, mistakes, and limits. The Metropolitan Police, stretched thin and organized in ways that appear foreign to modern readers, struggled to coordinate. The force was divided between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police for different jurisdictions. Investigators worked with scant forensics and under intense public pressure. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, faced an onslaught of criticism from both Parliament and the press. Investigative tactics included door-to-door inquiries, identity parades, neighborhood vigilance committees, and the posting of handbills. Police collected witness statements and preserved physical evidence. But scientific technique had limits. No DNA profiling, no national fingerprint database. Fingerprint systems were not yet in routine use, and limited capacity to cross-check identities in an immigrant and highly mobile population. Additionally, the police dealt with a tidal wave of misinformation, hoax letters, false leads, and deathbed confessions that proved shams. The public appetite for progress and closure often collided with the reality that Victorian policing had neither the tools nor the resources for a modern cold case-style resolution. Internal memos, docket entries, and contemporaneous correspondence preserved at the National Archives show a force trying to keep pace with public hysteria while working with the documentation and methodologies of the period. The Vigilance Committee and private citizens. Faced with perceived police inadequacy, local businessmen and citizens formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Their efforts, fundraising for patrols, distributing posters, offering rewards, were a crucial example of civic mobilization, yet they also fed into interinstitutional friction, which authority should lead. The committee's leader, George Lusk, became a public figure who even received the From Hell letter and the kidney parcel. The committee's presence underlines how communities attempted to respond to fear with self-help, and how social elites and local activists sometimes clashed over the right mix of compassion, control, and spectacle. Theories and suspects, a century of speculation. From the earliest days, the murders generated suspect lists that reflected social anxieties as much as forensic possibility. Theories range from itinerant butchers, medical men, aristocrats, artists, and even foreign conspiracies. Over decades, enthusiasts and scholars have named many suspects, some plausible, many fanciful. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the case has been revisited with new techniques, geographic profiling, archival research, DNA testing claims. Yet no consensus has emerged. Some suspects: Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who disappeared shortly after the last murder. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who was later institutionalized. Walter Sickert, a painter accused by some, defended by others. And Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor. All appear in the long list of proposed perpetrators. Each hypothesis shines a light on different evidentiary problems: patched historical files, ambiguous witness testimony, and the problem of confirmation bias when decades of rumor accumulate. As a result, the Ripper case is as much a cultural mirror for Britain's fears and obsessions as it is a police file to be closed. The aftermath: how the murders remade Whitechapel's reputation. The killings altered how Whitechapel was perceived by the rest of London and by the world. For many, the district became shorthand for the worst of urban modernity: squalor, exploitation, vice, and crime. Tourism and literature soon followed, transforming the scene of actual human tragedies into an imaginative landscape for fiction and Gothic storytelling. Penny dreadful serials, plays, and later novels used the Ripper as a symbol of modernity's anxieties. Yet this cultural appropriation often occluded the structural causes: poverty, housing instability, limited social support, that made the women vulnerable in the first place. Over time, local authorities, philanthropic organizations, and state reforms would slowly change the East End, but the Ripper's public legacy was already sealed as a macabre lens on Victorian London. Mary Jane Kelly. The room, the privacy, the horror. Mary Jane Kelly's murder stands out because it took place indoors, in a small rented room, 13 Miller's Court. She was killed in circumstances that gave the attacker more time and privacy than in a street attack. The condition of her body, and the intimate setting in which the murder occurred, made Kelly's death one of the most discussed and agonized over scenes in the series. It raised questions. Had the killer known her? Had he lured her inside? Did her indoor murder mark the escalation of a criminal whose violence was growing less impulsive and more methodical? Investigators at the time noted the degree of mutilation, and modern historians still debate what Kelly's death indicates about the offender's profile and composition. Kelly's story is also one in which social invisibility is stark. Living in a tiny room, in precarious employment and relationships, her vulnerability was typical of many women then and now. The anatomical debate and modern caution. Victorians often described the killer as possessing anatomical knowledge, an image the press relished. However, modern forensic historians are more cautious. Yes, the killer removed organs in some cases and inflicted deep cuts, but the wounds could be the result of opportunistic and violent attack rather than precise surgical technique. The presence of a removed kidney, if indeed it belonged to Eddowes, was provocative, but the evidence is not conclusive. Medical men of the time had different standards and training than today, and trauma on a victim's body in the chaotic conditions of an assault may not reveal the offender's formal expertise. Scholars like Paul Begg, Stuart Evans, and others have compiled exhaustive casebooks that weigh anatomical claims against the messy reality of Victorian crime scenes. The upshot: we must not let sensational metaphors outrun the available forensic evidence. Policing failures, scapegoating, and the politics of blame. When a city is scared, it seeks culpability. The police took blame. Immigrants and minorities sometimes became targets of xenophobic suspicion. Jewish residents of Whitechapel, including Kosminski's community, bore the brunt of some public vitriol, fueled by xenophobia in press and politics. The case also exposed fissures within government oversight of the police and spurred debates in Parliament. Some members of the public and press demanded drastic measures: curfews, radical policing strategies, and moral reform, measures that risked criminalizing the poor rather than addressing the root social problems. In short, the Ripper murders catalyzed not only investigative reform discussion, but also partisan and social scapegoating. The long tail: how the Ripper entered the modern imagination. Over the next century and more, Jack the Ripper's story mutated into novels, films, amateur sleuthing movements, and a global cottage industry of Ripperology. Each wave of commentary, new suspect lists, forensic claims, fictional retellings, reinvented the narrative for its era. Cultural historians point out that the Ripper's popularity is not merely about ghoulish curiosity, but about the case's function as a mirror. It allows writers and readers to explore anxieties about modern life, urban anonymity, gendered violence, class conflict, through the frame of an unsolved mystery. The Ripper, in other words, became an archetype of the unknown modern predator. The unresolved status of the case makes that archetype endlessly reusable. Recent scholarship, centering victims and new archival work. In the last 2 decades, there has been a methodological shift in Ripper studies. Rather than merely aggregating suspect lists, more historians focus on victims' biographies, social history, and archival rigor. Hallie Rubenhold's The Five is emblematic. It restores the women's identities, showing where they came from, how poverty structured their lives, and what led them to the streets and lodging houses of Whitechapel. Simultaneously, archival digitization at institutions like the National Archives has made police docket material, letters, and coroner reports more accessible, allowing historians to fact-check long-standing myths and to explore the institutional records that shaped the investigation. These efforts have not provided a smoking gun naming the killer, but they have enriched our understanding of why the case still matters. It speaks to institutions as much as to a single perpetrator. Why we never caught him, a synthesis. There are multiple reasons the killer was never definitively identified. 1. Police limits. Manpower, jurisdictional friction, and primitive forensics made a conclusive investigation hard. 2. Social invisibility. Many victims lived at the margins. Transient populations and reluctance to engage with police impeded witness development. 3. Media distortion. Hoaxers and journalists created noise that drowned reliable leads. Some hoax letters misdirected resources. Chance and skill. A determined, mobile offender in a crowded, chaotic urban environment could escape detection, especially before modern forensic science. Combined, these forces created conditions under which even a high-profile killer could remain anonymous. The lack of a final answer is historically frustrating but not inexplicable. The moral of the story: victims, structures, memory. If a documentary ethic has a duty, it is to remember the people behind the headlines. The Ripper case teaches about more than one violent man. It tells a story about social abandonment, press hunger, institutional weakness, and the ways in which violence against marginalized people can be turned into spectacle. Recentering the victims complicates the tidy narrative of a monstrous subject to be named and villainized. Instead, it asks us to attend to the social environments that produce vulnerability and to the human lives that were taken. Jack the Ripper remains a cipher, a name for a set of acts and a cultural obsession. We may never know the man or the men responsible, but the historical record, carefully read, still speaks. In coroner's notes, in lodging house registers, in the brittle paper of hoax letters, and in thin police docket entries. Each fragment helps us reconstruct the human scene. The alleyways, the landlords, the lonely women making private bargains with survival, the exhausted beat constable, the pathologist in a dim autopsy room, the anxious clerk copying a notice for circulation. That is the truer story, one of institutions and people, the living and the dead, far richer and more urgent than any single theory about identity. To understand Jack the Ripper is to hold in tension two truths. 1. An unknown assailant killed at least 5 women in 1888 in a way that shook Victorian Britain. And 2. The deeper tragedy is systemic. Poverty and anonymity made those deaths possible, and a sensational press and weak investigative infrastructure turned human lives into headlines. Contemporary scholarship invites us to move beyond morbid curiosity and toward an ethical remembrance, one that retrieves the victims' names, stories, and dignity from the fog of myth.